Chapter 8 Advanced Base to Camp 2. The following day we regrouped. Wish had found some interesting ice, which he wanted to boil, and stayed behind at Advanced Base with Burley, who was quite exhausted after his efforts on the previous day, and in no condition to go on. Constant and I were to escort the redundant porters back to base camp, returning next day. Jungle was to attempt to establish Camp 1 at 27,000 feet. Shoot would follow Jungle after taking films of our various departures. Shoot had been up since dawn working on his apparatus, but it still was not operational when Jungle set off, nor an hour later when Jungle set off again, having gone around in a circle the first time. I noticed that neither of them passed any comment on the other's progress, and hoped that this was not a sign of altitude lassitude. But Jungle, when passing Shoot the second time, made some remark about just swinging the compass, while Shoot turned his handle as though taking shots. I hope this did not indicate that they were trying to deceive each other, but I was too busy with my own affairs at the time to pay much attention. After getting ready, Constant and I delayed our departure as long as we could, wishing to provide Shoot with suitable material, but we were forced at last to set off unfilmed. We reached base camp without incident and found Prone anemic but cheerful. I spent the evening writing up my log and darning socks, while Constant confirmed with the reporters the arrangements for moving the camp and assured me that these were thoroughly understood. It was with light hearts that we returned in for the night. Prone, with his usual unselfishness, refused to let me share his tent. He said that Constant and I, who would climb together, ought not be parted. Constant was quite willing to let me go for one night, but I knew that Prone was right. Constant and I must lose no opportunity to learn more about each other. As it turned out, the only thing I was able to learn about Constant was that he was a good sleeper, for he dropped off as soon as I had settled down in my sleeping bag. We rose early, and I sent off the following dispatch. North Wall conquered and reconnaissance of Doodle begun. All well and happy and eager to come to grips with the mighty mountain which towers above us, daring us to set foot on our treacherous slopes. The team spirit remains first rate, and the porters are splendid. We said a final farewell to Prone. It was a deep disappointment to him, as indeed to all of us, that he was unable to accompany us. I wondered how his father would take the news of his incapacity. To his wife, no doubt, it would provide yet another means of tormenting the poor fellow. I did my best to cheer him up. I told him that the noble way in which he had borne his sufferings when a constant example and inspiration to us all, especially to me who knew his sad story. He patted me on the shoulder and said, "Yes, little man." He seemed quite pleased. We reached Advanced Base without incident. Constant fell into several crevices, and myself into one or two, but we were hauled out by the porters, who were quickly learning how to use the rope. Their names were Solo and Low too. They were short and sturdy. When not smoking skunk, which was seldom, they quarreled, or so it appeared to me, as they took absolutely no notice of Constant and myself except when we gave them orders, which they carried out meticulously but without the least sign of interest. Constant said that since we were now above 20,000 feet line, their dispositions would improve rapidly. I watched carefully for any sign of this happening, for to tell the truth I was somewhat overawed by their independence and impenetrability. I knew that the East is inscrutable, but I had hardly expected it to be inscrutable to my face. We reached a point at some little distance up the first wall of ice, climbing by steps we had used before, when Constant drew my attention to a small figure which was approaching us from the direction of base camp. There are occasions when life hits a man so hard that he feels incapable of controlling his own destiny. He is like an insect crushed beneath the foot of a giant. This was such an occasion for me, and I could see from Constance's face he was equally stricken. I dropped my eyes, hoping to forget what I had seen. "Can nothing be done?" I whispered. He shook his head. "I'll try, but it's practically hopeless." The small figure was climbing the steps. It was bowed almost double beneath an immense pile of kitchen utensils which clanked and rattled at every step. It ascended toward us like a figure from the nether regions, stopping finally a few yards below and turning towards us a flat nightmare of a face. Constant engaged in a long and violent conversation, during which Solo and Lo too puffed away contentedly at their pipes, while I tried to regain control of my destiny by meditating on Totter's thoughts at high altitudes. The wrangle came to an end at last, and Constant told me he had been quite unable to persuade Pong to return. Bribery, threats, and deceit had all proved useless. Pong, he said, was evidently a man with a purpose. Short of throwing rocks at him, Constance could think of no possible way of turning him back. He had, however, told him that he should go no further than advanced space, where he would need to minister to anybody who might return from the mountain weak and helpless. I said that this was rather hard on the weak and helpless. Constant agreed, but he saw no alternative. I thought for a while. The presence of Pong might endanger the whole expedition. Stomachs are delicate above 20,000 feet. Especially attractive food had been incorporated into high-altitude rations to tempt them. If Pong were to be let loose on the mountain, health and hope might vanish. Was it not, perhaps, for Constant myself to make the supreme sacrifice? To return to base with Pong and suffer his ministrations in order to spare the rest of the team? It was a great deal to ask of oneself. In the end, I decided against it. We were needed on the mountain. We could not leave the others unsupported. I slipped a dyspepsia tablet into my mouth and gave the word to advance. We reached advanced base safely. It was deserted. I buzzed the walkie-talkie and made contact with Wish. Everybody was at Camp 1. They would spend a day or two there to acclimatize for pushing on to Camp 2. This was satisfactory news. I told him to expect Constant and myself tomorrow and got him to describe the route. While he was speaking, I distinctly heard the strains of "Oh, My Darling Clementine" being sung in the background, and wished myself with the happy party. I noticed afterwards that the medical supplies were missing, and surmised they had been taken to Camp 1. This puzzled me at the time. I gathered later that it had happened by a mistake. Our meal that evening was hardly as unsavory as I feared it would be, being merely indigestible, but Constance said this was probably because Pong was not yet to use the high-altitude rations. In his opinion, the worst was yet to come. As it was, we were both unable to sleep, and I took the opportunity to make a few kindly inquiries about Constance's private life. I told him that it was not quite clear to me which of our party had fiancés and which had not, and asked him if he had one. He said no. I asked him if his parents were still living. He said yes. I asked him if he had any brothers or sisters. He said yes. I told him I had 3 sisters. He said oh. There was something wrong here. Nobody with a sense of atmosphere could be unaware of it. I lay for a while wondering how I might make contact with him and thinking how lonely is the human spirit, especially in grief. I suspected that Constance's taciturnity hid an aching heart. This is the sort of situation in which a conscientious leader often meets, and is possibly the one case when it is kinder to ignore the other's feelings. Although it is difficult to speak of one's troubles, it is always a relief. It is usually a greater kindness to make the sufferer speak of his sufferings than to respect his superficial desire to suffer them in silence. The best way to invite a confidence is to give one. Guessing that Constance's reluctance was associated with an unhappy love affair, I related to him an experience of my own which, although it caused me pain at the time, it was now over and done with. I hoped that this would encourage him with the hope that his pain too would pass. He made no comment on my story, so remarked that such things happened to most of us. Again there was no reply, but I became aware of a particular sound, and looking at Constant, I saw that he was curled up in his sleeping bag, quivering. The poor fellow was sobbing. Deeply moved, I put my hand to his shoulder. The sobbing became more violent. "Tell me about it, old chap," I said. I thought he was going to lose control of himself altogether, but gradually the paroxysm passed. He turned over, and I saw his cheeks were wet with tears. "Tell me," I said again. He hastily covered his face as the last 2 sobs were wrenched from him. Then he lay quite still. I could not help being aware that the atmosphere had changed, and I waited now in anticipation. I was not disappointed. He began to speak, slowly at first, hesitatingly, then with increasing fluency. As a boy, Constant had been a circus addict, and his passions, though discouraged by his parents, had continued throughout his life, changing only to mature with increasing age. His happiest memories were all connected with the circus. Its particular blending of personality, grandiloquence, and fantasy appealed to some deeply rooted romantic hunger. It was, he said, the some urge which dictated his choice of career. The people of the circus were to him more than ordinary people. They were at once his knights in armor, his fairies, his gnomes, his childhood princes and princesses. All of his childish romances centered on the circus. His first and only love had been a circus artiste. Her name was Stella. She performed with a troupe of seals. She was, said Constant, the loveliest creature in the world. Noblemen and princes worshipped her, but she was a simple girl at heart, and would have none of them. She had vowed to marry a simple man, and would bear him simple children. They loved at first sight, and were happy as only flowers can be. He saw her every performance. She kissed hand to him twice nightly, with matinees on Wednesday and Saturdays. There was but one flaw in the perfection of their private heaven. Travers, the chief male seal, took a dislike to Constant. Stella said it was jealousy. He barked whenever Constant approached her, and during performances he would come to the edge of the ring and pull faces at him, frightening the children. He began to refuse his food. The climax came when Stella walked on wearing Constant's engagement for the first time. When he saw it, Travers uttered a sound which tore the hearts of all present. He flung himself on ground and buried his face in his flippers. Stella was heartbroken. She was greatly attached to her seals, and felt their troubles as if they had been her child. She told Constant she could not bear to hurt Travers any longer. She had, moreover, great faith in his judgment. His aversion to Constant might indicate some serious defect in character which was hidden to her. Unless he could make friends with the animal, it must be all over between them. Constant vowed he would do it. It was an adventure after his own romantic heart. He sent to all corners of the sea fishy delicacies, and spent all his leisure with Travers, tempting him. But the poor animal remained unmoved. It would only eat from Stella's hand, and little enough at that. He became thin as an eel. Constant was frantic. He consulted authorities on seal psychology. He visited ancient seamen in various hemispheres. He sat for hours in his bath trying to put himself in Travers' place. His toes became permanently wrinkled, but the secret of the seal's affection remained hidden from him. One day, while strolling in the blackest despair through the West End of London, little caring what happened to him, he was seized by an uncontrollable impulse to justify his misery by performing some irretrievable act of degradation. Uttering a cry which changed the lives of 3 bystanders, he hung himself madly into a new cinema. A cartoon was just beginning. It opened with a rocky shore where a pretty mermaid was charming the creatures of the deep with a song. Amongst her audience was a large, healthy-looking seal, which was listening with an expression of complete ecstasy. With a thrill, Constant saw that it was the image of Travers in his happier moments. He dashed from the cinema and took a taxi straight to the circus, where he rushed to Travers' tank and laid bare his soul in a passionate rendering of collar heron. The effect was startling. Lions roared, dogs howled, elephants trumpeted and stamped, an acrobat fell on his friend, and 3 clowns gave their notice on the spot. But Constant was oblivious to these trivia, for Travers was sitting up in the water with a smile of ultimate bliss, accompanying Constant in a well-modulated bass voice. The circus manager rushed in and offered Constant a contract at a fabulous salary. Constant brushed him aside and hurried to Stella's dressing room. Back they came together. Constant and Travers continued their duet. Stella gave a cry of love and flung herself at the ecstatic Constant. As she did so, Travers gave a thunderous bellow. Astonished, she turned to the beast and tried to stroke its head. To her horror, it bit her hand. That was the end. The animal had transferred its affections to Constant and was insanely jealous of Stella. Heartbroken and furious, she told him to take the beast he had stolen and go. He clapped Travers in his arms and ran sobbing into the street, where he took a taxi to the zoo. All the time, Travers had continued to render his part of collar heron. Constant was sobbing again, his face hidden in his sleeping bag. I waited until the fit had passed, then assured him of deepest sympathy and said that I knew what a relief it have been to tell me about it. He nodded. He was, he said, feeling better already. He had even begun to hope that I had at last conquered his grief. I turned from him to wipe away a tear. The rewards of leadership are not always so immediate or so intense. Who I had composed myself, I asked him. I think it's when I had composed myself. I asked him what had happened to Travers. The animal, he told me, had started a male choir among the zoo seals. Constance sang with them on Saturday afternoons. That night, both Constance and I slept soundly. I had a recurring nightmare in which I saw Constance's face at the home when he recognized Pong as the figure following us. But when it came closer, it turned out to be a flat-faced seal which sobbed heartbrokenly and tried to hide itself But when it came closer, it turned out to be a flat-faced seal which sobbed heartbrokenly and tried to hide itself in the sleeping bag, which was much too small for it. I woke unrested. Constant was also tired out, having been seized with repeated bouts of sobbing which made the tent shake. He said they were due to habit and did not indicate grief anymore, which was a comfort to me. We were really in no condition to go on, but the mountain was less terrifying than the prospect of Pong's meals. We left him behind with great relief and assurances that we had never eaten so well in our lives. We told him that we would hurry back to partake as soon as possible of his culinary marvels. This, we assured him, would be the high spot of our adventure, the reward for difficulties surmounted, the silver lining, our cloud of toil. We begged him to stay where he was so as not to disappoint us. We left him washing up and glowering. We set off for Camp 1 by the route which Wish had described to us. Just above the advanced base, a steep ridge rose for some 5,000 feet before merging into the face of the mountain. Our path lay up the left face of this ridge. Constant and I were using oxygen. We found the apparatus so uncomfortable that we allowed Solo to lead. The porters refused the aid of oxygen. I think they thought it was witchcraft. After a short distance, the ground steepened, and soon we, or rather the porters, were cutting steps in hard ice. We were now high. Every step climbed demanded the equivalent effort to running up 153 steps at sea level. The figure is Wish's. The great ordeal had begun at last. We could now number ourselves among those who had trod the ultimate heights and had invaded nature's last stronghold against the advancing spirit of man. I tried to remember all that I had read about climbing at such heights. I took one step, then waited for 10 minutes. This, I understood, was essential. Our predecessors were unanimous about it. 1 step, then 10 minutes of rest, or 7 in an emergency. I found it more difficult than I had anticipated. To remain in one position for 10 minutes was not at all easy. First, I tended to fall over sideways. Then I got a cramp in the calf. Then my nose started to itch. Then my foot started to vibrate and had to be held down with both hands. This was very tiring. When I crouched to hold my foot, I was lower than I had been before making the step, which caused me to wonder whether I was gaining height or losing it, and the mental strain was so great that I lost control of myself and fell off my step. I was pulled up by Solo and tried again. I was beginning to appreciate all I had read concerning the rigors of high-altitude climbing. But I noticed that the others seemed to be ignoring the procedure. While I was struggling to maintain my posture, they would shuffle about freely on their steps and even show signs of impatience. This I could understand in the case of the porters, but Constant, I thought, should know better. I was about to expostulate when he said, "What on earth do you think you're doing, Binder?" I explained, and to my surprise, he went off into fits of laughter. He said that early climbers had been forced to rest after every few steps because they were out of breath. This was because they were not using oxygen. Nobody, he said, need rest any longer than he wanted to. At any rate, my rate of progress, we would never get up the mountain. This was a surprise to me, but after thinking it over, it seemed quite reasonable, and I decided to give it a fair trial. I found to my delight that the going was not appreciably heavier than it had been the previous day. I mention this incident, in which I appear in no very admirable light, because it is a striking illustration of how one may be misled by book knowledge. It was less It was a lesson to me as a reader to take nothing on trust, and as a writer to take the greatest of care not to mislead my readers. I hate to think what my progress might have been had Constant not been there to put me right. I soon found the going quite difficult enough, and I began to expect the onset of those strange phenomena which occur in rarefied atmospheres. I remarked to Constant that I would like to hear of any unusual experiences he might have, and when we stopped for a rest, I called the others on the radio and reminded them of the same thing. They were still at Camp 1, not yet acclimatized. Burley, to whom I spoke, told me that Wish had been particularly objectionable that morning. Did I think this was one of the symptoms I was interested in? I assured him that it undoubtedly was, and thanked him. Wish apparently seized the apparatus at this point, for his voice now came through, telling me that there was every reason for his attitude. Burley had snored heavily the whole night, and Wish had been quite unable to get a wink. The snores, he said, were not, as he had expected, attenuated due to rarefied atmosphere, but were much louder, more complicated, and altogether more objectionable than they had ever been before. This, he said, was an example of how a man's true and bestial nature is revealed at high altitudes. Burley was clearly unfitted for social life above 20,000 feet, if indeed he could be considered fit for it at any altitude. I commiserated with Wish, but asked him to be kind to his friend, who had much to bear. He promised to remember my words and asked me to keep a lookout for Wharton's Whorples. Off we went again, climbing well, restraining the impetuous Solo who was inclined to rush the mountain, fault to which all beginners are prone. A novice will tire himself out within an hour, while the veteran keeps going the day at the same steady pace. Higher and higher we climbed. All the time our legs grew weaker, our breathing more labored. It was now becoming necessary to stop quite often, but at first I found it almost a pleasure to stop because I had to and not because I had thought to. The magnificent sceneries around me had become much less interesting. I found myself concentrating on the seat of Constant's trousers, he being ahead of me. I thought I had never seen such a disgusting trousers seat in all my life. I thought that Constant ought to be ashamed himself for owning such a seat. I thought how different was the seat of Burley's trousers. I noted this down in my diary that evening as an interesting effect of high altitude. We reached 27,000 feet in remarkably good time and looked around for Camp 1. To our dismay, it was nowhere to be seen. I called up the others on the radio. Chute answered. I described to him as well as I could the route we had taken and the nature of our immediate surroundings. He said that as far as he could make out, we were actually at Camp 1. He advised me to find some high spot from which we might get a good view. This was all very well, but the face of the ridge at this point was a maze of high spots. Tents might be hidden behind any one of 100 crags or pinnacles. We reconnoitered, and we shouted. We whistled, and we yodeled. We exploded paper bags, all to no result. We had just sat down to think it over when Constant gave a strangled cry and pointed downward. Below, ascending by steps we had cut, was a dark and grim figure. Pong! This was awful. We held a hurried council of war. Pong was heavily laden. He seemed to have brought all the cooking equipment and most of the food we had left at advanced base. It was just possible we could shake him off. We would abandon the search for Camp 1. We would climb as quickly and as high as we could and establish Camp 2, and we could go no further. While we were talking, Pong had drawn alarmingly close, and when we moved off, I had to fight against unmanly panic. Constant said he had known nothing like it since being chased by a bull at Broadstairs on a bank holiday. We gave Solo his head with the step cutting and did our best to keep up with him. He set a tremendous pace. I doubt whether steps have ever been cut so quickly at any altitude. There was something unnatural about it. Mountaineering at 27,000 feet was supposed to be something almost superhuman. Yet Solo, without oxygen, was cutting steps so quickly as we, with oxygen, could climb them. It was wrong. It worried me. I was also worried about Constant's bull. It seemed to me very unlikely that there should be a loose bull at Broadstairs on bank holiday. Was Constant deceiving me? I also felt ashamed of myself for doubting him, which added to my worries. In spite of our spanking pace, Pong continued to gain on us. Faster and faster we went. Constant and I became dizzy and fell frequently. I became a mass of bruises. Constant was in even worse condition, being taller than I. He had further to fall. The climax came when, after a particularly bad fall, he found himself being picked up by Pong, who had caught up with us. Constant uttered a horrid cry and clapped senseless. I revived him by hitting his head and asked what we should do. He said that since I obviously was in no condition to go on, we had better camp where we were. This we did. I found that the height was 29,000 feet. We had established Camp 2 as originally planned, but this was small satisfaction to us at the time. We could think of nothing but the digestive horrors to come.